Hello, everyone. Today I am going to be talking about the NFL schedule and the biggest problems that I have with it. As we know, the NFL schedule was recently released, and it's an event that a lot of football fans get excited for during the NFL offseason, as they get to see when their favorite teams are playing which opponents and which time slots on which days, blah, blah, blah. But I, along with a number of other football fans, have noticed a ton of problems with the schedule this year, to the point where some of us are even questioning if the NFL used AI to make the schedule. So today, I'm going to be breaking down the NFL schedule week by week and expressing my biggest issues with each week of the NFL season. These issues will range from when certain teams are playing each other, which stations or streaming services are going to be broadcasting or streaming certain games, the time slots for certain games, and being a Patriots fan, some of the issues that I have with the Patriots schedule this year. Now, there might be a few weeks every now and then that I don't have any real issues with, so therefore I'll just be simply skipping those weeks. But trust me, there's a lot of problems that we're going to be talking about in this video. And I'll also talk about issues that I personally don't have a problem with, but issues that I know lots of other football fans have problems with. Without further ado, let's begin. Starting with week 1, my biggest complaint about the week 1 schedule is the 425 window. As we know, Tom Brady is going to be making his broadcasting debut with Fox in America's Game of the Week, which will be a matchup between the Cowboys and the Browns. Now, obviously, with me being a Patriots fan, I'm really looking forward to seeing Tom make his broadcasting debut. But the biggest issue I have with the 425 window is the other game that's going to be on opposite of Dallas versus Cleveland. Now, as you probably already know, games that are scheduled at 425 are part of a doubleheader that's either broadcast by CBS or Fox each week. And one game in the 425 window typically stands out as the game of the week, with any other games being played in that time slot being played out in the West Coast. But for some reason, the NFL decided to schedule another game at 425 that doesn't involve any West Coast teams or whatnot, with that being, of course, the Commanders taking on the Buccaneers down in Tampa. My biggest issue with that is that Tom Brady played 3 seasons down in Tampa, and Tampa fans who live in the local area won't be able to watch the man that restored relevance into their franchise make his broadcasting debut, all because the NFL decided to put the Buccaneers on at the same time as Tom's broadcasting debut. And again, the NFL didn't have to do this, as Washington and Tampa aren't West Coast teams. They could have easily just put this game on at 1 o'clock. So for the NFL to put Tampa on at the same time as Tom's broadcasting debut, it just doesn't make sense. I don't get it. And trust me, people, this is something that we're going to be seeing a lot of as we continue criticizing the schedule. Oh, and as for the Peacock game, we'll talk about that at a later point in this video. I really don't have anything to complain about from weeks 2 to 4, so let's just jump ahead to week 5. Looking at the week 5 schedule, my biggest complaint, once again, comes from the 425 window. Currently, the NFL has Packers at Rams slated as that week's game of the week. And while I do think that is a good game, and a game that obviously should be played at 425 due to it being played out in LA, I just think that there were better options that the NFL could have slotted into the 425 time slot and advertised as the game of the week. 2 games from the 1 o'clock time slot that stand out to me as better options for game of the week are Ravens versus Bengals and Bills versus Texans. For one, Ravens versus Bengals is a matchup between not only the 2 best teams in the AFC North, but 2 of the best teams in the AFC, as both teams are entering the season as Super Bowl contenders. And as for Bills Texans, you obviously have the intriguing storyline of Stefon Diggs facing his old team in the Bills, who traded him to Houston during the offseason, as well as the other intriguing storylines such as both teams being 2 top contenders in the AFC. These are 2 great games that could have both easily fit well into the 425 time slot. Because when you think about it, when you have 2 great games like these being played in the same week, you can't just have both of them being played at 1 p.m. opposite each other. You just can't do that. At least one game has to be played on national TV, which is where the 425 time slot would fit in. Clearly, just something that the schedule makers did not think through, not having one of these games being played in the game of the week time slot, and instead settling for a good but not as good game for Week 5's game of the week. We now move on to Week 6, which is the point in the season where I really start to have issues with the NFL schedule. To start off, we're once again talking about the 425 window. As you can see, the Lions and Cowboys are going to be squaring off at 425 on Fox in Week 6's game of the week. And as highly anticipated as this game is going to be, sadly, a few parts of the country are not going to be able to see this game because for some reason, the NFL also decided to schedule Falcons versus Panthers opposite of Detroit versus Dallas. Similar to Washington versus Tampa in Week 1, this is another instance of the NFL scheduling an additional game at 425 that isn't being played out in the West Coast or involving any West Coast teams. The NFL could have easily just scheduled Atlanta versus Carolina to be played at 1 o'clock, allowing people who live in both local areas to watch Detroit versus Dallas at 425. But instead, the NFL decided to schedule Atlanta versus Carolina to be played at 425 for no good reason, forcing people who live in both local areas to watch this awful game instead of America's game of the week. Another big issue I have with Week 6 is the Sunday night contest, which will be played between the Bengals and the Giants. Seriously, what the hell made the NFL think that this would be a great matchup for Sunday night football? You've got a Super Bowl contending Bengals team going up against a rebuilding Giants team? Like, what? Do they seriously think it'll be entertaining to watch Joe Burrow toss as many touchdowns as Daniel Jones will have turnovers? The final of this game is going to be like 48-6 Bengals. Like, why is this being played on Sunday Night Football? I don't understand. Moving on to Week 7, my biggest complaint about this week is how come the Texans and Packers are playing at 1 o'clock? I mean, this is a matchup between CJ Stroud and Jordan Love, two young up-and-coming QBs who exceeded expectations last year, took their respective teams to the playoffs, won a playoff game each, and are only expected to be better this year. So with that being said, how come a matchup like this isn't being played in primetime? It doesn't make sense to me. Looking at the Week 8 schedule, the first issue that I have is that no teams are on a bye this week. For those of you who don't know, bye weeks typically start in Week 5, and they continuously run all the way until Week 13 or 14, meaning that at least two teams will have a bye each week from Week 5 to Week 13 or 14, with the only exception in that time span being Thanksgiving week, because obviously it's Thanksgiving. But for some reason, the only week, minus Thanksgiving, that doesn't have any teams taking a bye in that time span is Week 8. What makes this stand out in the worst of ways is that this is the second straight season where the NFL didn't schedule any teams for a bye in Week 8. Yeah, you heard me right. No teams had a bye in Week 8 last season, and the NFL just repeated the same mistake with this season's schedule. Another issue I have with Week 8 is the Monday night game. Seriously, why are we getting so many Giants games in prime time? Jumping ahead 3 weeks to Week 11, my biggest issue from this week comes from two matchups, one between the Packers and Bears and the other between the Ravens and Steelers. No, I don't have a problem with the matchups themselves or the time slot that they're being played in. My biggest issue with these games is that for the Bears and Steelers, these will be their first divisional matchups of the season. Yes, the Bears and Steelers are not going to be playing games within their own division until this late into the season. How the NFL never took note of the fact that the Bears and Steelers won't be playing any divisional games for the first 10 weeks of the season, I have no clue. The final 6 weeks of the regular season probably have the most glaring issues of this schedule. So why don't we kick it off with Week 13? My biggest issue with this week is the fact that all West Coast teams that are playing on Sunday are going to be playing out in the East Coast or Central Time Zone. Yes, the NFL somehow scheduled no West Coast games to be played in Week 13's Sunday slate of games. Again, I don't know how the NFL completely misses or just flat out ignores these types of things. What really makes this an issue is that it leaves them with no viable options for the 4 p.m. to 4:25 window, as West Coast games typically take up a majority of that window, forcing the NFL to schedule a couple of random games in that Sunday slate to be played in the 4 p.m. to 4:25 window, even though those said games could have just easily been played at 1 o'clock had the NFL scheduled West Coast games for that Sunday. Currently, the NFL has Rams at Saints and Buccaneers at Panthers playing in that 4 p.m. time slot. Obviously, while Rams Saints isn't a West Coast game, I can at least understand it filling a void in that 4 p.m. time slot due to it involving a West Coast team, obviously that being the Rams. But as for Buccaneers Panthers, yeah, that was just forced to fill in the other void left in that 4 p.m. window. And as I alluded to earlier, it's another example of the NFL scheduling games not involving West Coast teams into the late window for no reason. Oh, and the other problem I have with this week actually ties into my first problem of no West Coast games being played on Sunday, with that being the complete WTF Monday night game between the Browns and Broncos. Seriously, why is the NFL scheduling so many primetime matchups where a playoff bound team squares off against a rebuilding team? It's not right. And do you know what makes it even worse if you haven't guessed it already? Yeah, this game's being played out in Denver. So they could have easily just scheduled this game in the 4 p.m. window on Sunday instead of forcing select random games to be played at 4. And it also would have allowed them to schedule a much better matchup for Monday Night Football, too. Well, guess we should just continue because the issues with the NFL schedule are only going to get worse from here on out. Okay, probably my biggest issue with the NFL schedule, not just this year, but ever since they expanded the schedule to 17 games, is the fact that they schedule teams to have their bye week in week 14. I absolutely hate week 14 buys because by that point in the season, it's mid December, a time of the year where every team should be focused on football and fighting for their playoff lives. So by giving teams a bye week in week 14, you're throwing their schedule and possibly their mindset off because now they're in a relaxed state of mind knowing that they're on their bye week, which could potentially make them lose focus on their mission and goals when they do return from their bye week during those final weeks of the season. And if they lose focus and wind up not playing well during those final weeks, it could potentially cost them a playoff berth. So the fact that they continue to not only schedule week 14 buys, but also, in my opinion, flat out abuse them is just ridiculous. And what do I mean by the NFL schedule makers abuse week 14 buys? Well, to start off, this is the third season in a row where the Commanders have a week 14 bye. This is also the second time in the last 4 years that my Patriots have a week 14 bye. This is also the third time in the last 4 years that the Colts have a week 14 bye. And to cap off, this is the second time in these last 4 years that 6 teams have a week 14 bye. So considering all this, I think it's fair to say that the NFL loves to abuse the hell out of week 14 buys. And my God, does it need to stop. Because week 14 buys have quite literally been the worst thing about the NFL schedule since 2021. Oh, and remember what I said about week 8 having no teams on bye? Well, maybe had the schedule makers actually scheduled buys that week, we would have had no teams on bye in week 14. Just a thought. Also, another issue I have with this week is that the Browns and Steelers are playing each other for the second time in 3 weeks. Yeah, that's another issue I have with the NFL schedule every year. The fact that they make divisional opponents play each other twice in a 3 week span, when you have a whole 18-week schedule to space out divisional matchups. Which is also something that could have been avoided had the NFL, I don't know, scheduled the Steelers to play a divisional opponent sometime before Week 11. Alright, the good news is I'm done talking about why Week 14 sucks the most. The bad news is the problems don't get any better from here on out. Week 15 is the part of the season where I really start to question if the NFL used AI to create the schedule. Because why the hell do CBS and Fox both have double headers this week? Week 15 just seems like such a random week to have both stations airing double headers. I know it's late in the season and you got teams fighting for their playoff lives, but still, it's not like it's week 1 or week 18. It's week 15, and we're still a few weeks away from the end of the regular season. Yet here we are airing double headers on both stations. Just why? The NFL isn't doing their ratings any favors either, as you got some people tuning into CBS's doubleheader, while others are tuning into Fox's doubleheader, when it's clear and obvious that if you have just one station airing the doubleheader, then all your fans would easily be attracted and tuned into that station. And as for both stations' game of the week in that doubleheader time slot, while I do agree with Bills Lions being CBS's marquee matchup, I can't really say the same thing about Steelers Eagles, as that's just a good but not great game for Fox's game of the week, in my opinion. Maybe if this were being played earlier in the season, then I could see it being advertised as America's Game of the Week. But this late in the season, when you have Super Bowl contenders squaring off against each other in this time slot, I just don't think it fits the label of America's Game of the Week, especially when comparing it to a lot of the other games throughout the season that are being advertised as such. Oh, and don't get me started on, oh, it's the Battle of Pennsylvania. It automatically makes it suitable for America's Game of the Week. No, if that was the NFL's reasoning behind scheduling Steelers Eagles in the 425 time slot, bullshit. These two teams squared off back in week 8 of 2022. They were equally as good back then compared to now, and that contest was a 1 p.m. duel, so I don't understand the need to put this contest at 425. What the NFL should have done instead was schedule Steelers Eagles at 1 p.m. on Fox, Buccaneers Chargers at 4 p.m. on Fox, and then just have CBS air the doubleheader themselves with their three designated 425 matchups. But hey, what the hell do I know? Jumping to week 16, my first problem comes from that week's Saturday lineup. Not the games themselves, rather the kickoff times and the stations that will be airing both games. First off, why the hell are the kickoff times 1 and 4:30? Typically when the NFL airs two games on Saturday, the first game kicks off at 4:30 and the second game kicks off in prime time at around 8. So 1 and 4:30 kickoff times on a Saturday this late in the season doesn't make any sense. Doesn't the NFL typically make sure to always put at least one game in prime time for each day that there's football on? As for the stations that are airing both games, why is Steelers Ravens being broadcasted on Fox? The reason why I don't get that is because Fox never airs Saturday games. They only do that during the years where Christmas were to land on a Sunday, where they, along with CBS, would broadcast their whole entire package of games on Saturday, Christmas Eve, as opposed to Sunday, Christmas Day. So why is Fox being granted the rights to air one of the two Saturday games this week? It just seems bizarre. Why not air Steelers Ravens on NFL Network instead, like most Saturday games? And as for Texans Chiefs, while I don't mind this game being broadcasted on NBC since NBC carries Sunday Night Football, which is a nationally televised package unlike Fox's package, which is meant for Sunday afternoon games, I do feel as if Texans Chiefs, in all honesty, could have been exclusively streamed on Peacock. What do I mean by that? Well, remember earlier I said I was going to address the Week 1 Peacock game at a later point in this video? Well, here it is. When you think about it, it doesn't make sense that the NFL forced the Packers-Eagles matchup down in Brazil to be played on the Friday night of Week 1 just to make that the Peacock game, when they could have just easily made the Texans-Chiefs late-season Saturday matchup the Peacock exclusive instead, considering they granted NBC the rights to broadcast this game. And in case you forgot, Peacock is owned by NBC, and Peacock streams all of NBC's games, so any game that's exclusively streamed on Peacock is part of NBC's Sunday Night Football package. And what makes the NFL look even more ridiculous for making Packers-Eagles the Peacock game is that last season, when they aired a Peacock exclusive for the first time, They actually aired it on the Saturday of Week 16. So it really does emphasize my point that Packers-Eagles being forcibly played on the Friday night of Week 1, all just to make that the Peacock game, makes zero sense, when Texans-Chiefs could have easily just been the Peacock game instead. The other issue I have with this week is that this week will feature the first time that the Patriots and Bills will be squaring off this season, which of course means that the next time these two will square off will be 2 weeks later in Week 18. Yeah, as if the NFL scheduling divisional teams to play each other twice in a random 3 week span every year wasn't already bad enough. The fact that they'll also wait all the way until Week 16 to finally schedule two teams' first divisional matchup, only to have them play 2 weeks later in the final week of the season, is just criminal. Week 17, and oh boy, this is the part of the schedule that I know a lot of you have been talking about for obvious reasons, as the NFL has now partnered with yet another streaming service this year, airing both Christmas Day games on Netflix. Now, I'm just going to be honest with you. I personally don't have that big of an issue with the NFL putting games on streaming services, as I do see myself as a big streaming service user when I get older and eventually get my own house. And I honestly just feel as if the use of streaming services is just part of the world of technology continuously expanding as time goes on. But with that being said, I know a majority of people have been unhappy about the NFL's shift to streaming services as of late. And like I said earlier in the video, I was not only going to address my personal issues with the schedule, but issues that all football fans have with this season's schedule in general. So, with that being said, I will still talk about the problems that everyone has with the NFL's shift to streaming services and the overall negative impact that it could have in the future. With how the NFL has continuously put more and more games on streaming services over the years, it's obviously made it hard for a lot of people to watch the game they love, as they now have to spend extra money on those streaming services, as opposed to watching everything on cable TV. And it obviously makes it harder for those people who don't even have access to streaming, such as elderly people or people who live in rural areas, mainly due to their lack of experience with technology. It would currently cost you almost $1,000 to be able to watch every game this season if you were to purchase a cable package, as well as all the 6 streaming services that are going to be exclusively streaming games this season. And if the NFL continues this trend of putting more and more games on streaming services, it could eventually lead to all regular season games, and hell, maybe even the Super Bowl being exclusively streamed, which most likely will not end well for the NFL, as it could lead to either an outbreak by fans, or it could lead to the NFL's viewership dropping, as fans won't be willing to pay money for all these streaming services. So yeah, overall, this sudden growth of streaming services over the past couple years has been a problem among most football fans, and it could easily lead to the downfall of the NFL, which is why it stands out as one of the biggest problems on the NFL schedule. As for personal issues that I have with this week, my first gripe has to do with the kickoff times of the Christmas Day games, because just like the 2 Saturday games the week prior, I don't understand why the kickoff times for these games are 1 and 4:30. It makes no sense. Secondly, this is the second season in a row that the Ravens are going to be playing on the road on Christmas. Now, playing on Christmas 2 years in a row isn't a big issue, but if you're making a team play on Christmas on the road for a second straight year, you're essentially screwing them over, as you're taking them away from their homes and loved ones on the most wonderful holiday of the year and back-to-back years. And that's just terrible. My third issue comes from the 5 games that the NFL is going to be choosing from for a Saturday triple header this week. Now, in case you don't know, typically during a couple of the later weeks in the season, the NFL will air a Saturday triple header on NFL Network, and they will set aside 5 games for that said week and choose which 3 of those games they'd like to air in that triple header. But the 5 games that the NFL has set aside to choose from for Week 17's triple header flat out suck. You have Broncos-Bengals, a matchup between a Super Bowl contending Bengals team and a bottom 5 Broncos team. Yeah, must-watch TV right there. Then you got Cardinals-Rams, a pretty mid matchup at best, considering the Rams are a playoff-bound team, while the Cardinals, we still don't really know what they're truly made of. Then there's Chargers-Patriots, a matchup between two of the worst teams from a year ago. Then there's Colts-Giants, which features a decent Colts team squaring off against a bottom-dwelling Giants team. And then maybe the best matchup of this bunch, although that's not saying much, is Falcons-Commanders, which features a playoff-bound Falcons team facing off against a Commanders team that could make some noise this season. We'll have to wait and see. But yeah, you get my point. None of these games scream must-watch TV, as at least one team from each contest is either bad or has a ton of question marks surrounding them. And when you have those types of teams being featured in a football game, that doesn't really translate into must-watch football. And the fact that the NFL chose these 5 games to choose from for this week's triple header is just confusing, as it makes you wonder what the hell was the NFL thinking. My final issue with this week has to do with the matchup between the Packers and Vikings. Why do I have an issue with this game? Because this is the 4th season in a row that the Packers and Vikings will be squaring off in Week 17. How does the NFL keep doing stuff like this? We finally reached Week 18, and my biggest problem with this week is that some matchups are exactly the same as they've been in Week 18 the last couple of years. As a lot of you already know, the NFL only schedules divisional matchups in Week 18, and very rarely do they schedule the same divisional matchups in back-to-back years. But despite that, this is the 2nd season in a row that both NFC North games will be exactly the same in terms of both matchup and location, as the Vikings and Lions will be facing off in Detroit in Week 18 for the 2nd consecutive season, while the Bears and Packers will be facing off in Green Bay this week for the 2nd consecutive season as well. And as if that wasn't bad enough, this will also be the 3rd season in a row that both NFC East games will be the exact same. So yeah, I'm just once again asking myself how the NFL continues to miss things like this. So, now that I'm done pointing out all the issues with the NFL schedule, what are my final thoughts on this season's schedule, as well as what I think should happen moving forward? Well, with the seemingly endless amount of issues that I talked about in this video, I, along with many other people, do consider this to be one of the worst schedules to be put together, maybe even the worst. And the guy who creates the schedule, Mike North, yeah, he needs to be fired. Because with how bad the schedule is, it shows that he put very little thought and care into the schedule making process, which is simply inexcusable, especially considering how advanced technology is today and how it can aid him and the rest of the team in the schedule making process. And if he couldn't make a good 18-week schedule this year, then I have every reason to believe he won't be capable of creating a good schedule in future seasons. So yeah, that's all I really have to talk about. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time. Look after yourselves, people.